There is a passage in Saint Adamnam's Life of Columba that I thought was very worthy of being commented on, and this passage has not really been given this level of attention or this level of depth of analysis beforehand, so I thought it was a good opportunity to do so on this channel. It is from Book 2, Chapter 28, which is subtitled, How an Aquatic Monster Was Driven Off by Virtue of the Blessed Man's Prayers. So let's read it. On another occasion also, when the blessed man was living for some days in the province of the Picts, he was obliged to cross the river Nessa, in brackets the Ness, and when he reached the bank of the river, he saw some of the inhabitants burying an unfortunate man, who, according to the account of those who were burying him, was a short time before seized, as he was swimming, and bitten most severely by a monster that lived in the water. His wretched body was, though too late, taken out with a hook by those who came to his assistance in a boat. The blessed man, on hearing this, was so far from being dismayed that he directed one of his companions to swim over and row across the cobble that was moored at the further bank. And Lugnam Mocnaman, hearing the command of the excellent man, obeyed without the least delay, taking off all his clothes except his tunic and leaping into the water. But the monster, which so far from being satiated was only roused for more prey, was lying at the bottom of the stream, and when it felt the water disturbed above by the man swimming, suddenly rushed out, and, giving an awful roar, darted after him, with its mouth wide open as the man swam in the middle of the stream. Then the blessed man, observing this, raised his holy hand, while all the rest, brethren as well as strangers, were stupefied with terror, and invoking the name of God, formed the saving sign of the cross in the air, and commanded the ferocious monster, saying, Thou shalt go no further, nor touch the man. Go back with all speed. Then, at the voice of the saint, the monster was terrified, and fled more quickly than if it had been pulled back with ropes, though it had just got so near to Lugna as he swam that there was not more than the length of a spear staff between the man and the beast. Then the brethren, seeing that the monster had gone back, and that their comrade Lugna returned to them in the boat safe and sound, were struck with admiration, and gave glory to God in the blessed man. And even the barbarous heathens who were present were forced by the greatness of this miracle, which they themselves had seen, to magnify the God of the Christians. Now, did something catch your eye in that story? Because it did for me, which was the location that it happened in. Saint Columba was obliged to cross the River Nessa, and it's the editor who is included in there the modern name, the Ness, which is what he did with the place names throughout the Life of Columba. So this monster is seen in the River Ness. So of course, this made me think: is this referring to what is now commonly known as the Loch Ness Monster? Just before we go on to that, I would like to point out that this is not the only example of a monster in water in the lives of Irish saints. These are some other examples that I am aware of that have this similarity. It's not necessarily the same animal specifically, but just that it's a large animal, monstrous animal, you could say, that is in water in the lives of other Irish saints. Also, I think it's worth looking at this similar theme outside of the context of Ireland. There's a YouTube channel, an excellent YouTube channel, that is a big inspiration for my channel as well, called Nicodemus Hadgerite, who did a video, which I'll link in the description, called The Saints on Dragons, kind of scrolling text video, which also my channel has done videos like that, the same type of scrolling text. And so the point is, this is something that we can see east and west in the first and second millennium. There's a big consensus on the point of there being animals, large and dangerous animals, that are not known to our modern biologists, basically, probably because they went extinct. The strength of this kind of evidence depends on someone's worldview. For an Orthodox Christian, we believe in sainthood, and so if we see something in the lives of many, many saints, it's a strong evidence inside of this paradigm. As for that kind of empirical evidence that other people would really require to feel confident about believing in this, it is easy to conceive how, especially in the case of aquatic animals, the skeletons could have been lost. Finally, from the Christian worldview, that this is especially sealed by the fact that these kind of large creatures are not only in the lives of the saints. We have a prominent example in the Bible. In the book of Jonah, the prophet Jonah is swallowed by a whale, or probably a more accurate translation is a great fish. And some Christians have tried to argue, which I think is a terrible argument, that this is an animal that is known to modern biology, for example, a blue whale or a sperm whale, and this has already really been refuted, and I think the far better interpretation of this is that it was an animal that is not known to modern biology. Actually, the totally secular scientific establishment, it does believe in aquatic monsters that lived in the past. What they would call it is dinosaurs. Those dinosaurs that lived underwater. Now, of course, they're of the position that they didn't coincide with human beings on Earth, but the point is here, there's a pretty wide range of different evidences for larger, like the animals in the sea and in waters generally of today are much smaller than ones that would have existed in the past. Just as an example, the Paleosaurus, which I use as an example because this is kind of what needs to be mentioned in regards to the Loch Ness Monster, and the other one, just one that I know I'm familiar with, is the Megalodon, and that this even totally secular scientists agree on this sort of more general point that larger animals existed in the past. So now, finally, let's really drive at the point of the Loch Ness Monster. Now, this is something that I didn't really know anything about besides what I suppose everyone knows, which is that there's a theory that there is an animal in Loch Ness. And the impression that I had early on was that there probably wouldn't be such strong evidence for this, maybe some eyewitness reports. And I was also aware of this photo, pretty unconvincing photo in my opinion. That was one of the things that I knew about this beforehand. Reading this thing in the Life of Columba made me then interested to look into it in more depth, which was the first time that I had ever really looked into the Loch Ness Monster in depth. That is when I came upon an article by Henry H. Bowyer that is titled "The Case for the Loch Ness Monster, the Scientific Evidence." This proved to be a very interesting and quite short read, so I would recommend it for anyone who is interested to scratch the surface here. And one of the main things that I could take away from it is that, maybe it's just because people are uninformed because they're not particularly interested in it, but I do feel like a lot of people are probably put off looking at the Loch Ness Monster in a serious way because they haven't really encountered what the people who do believe in it consider actually to be the strongest evidence. For example, the photo that I showed earlier, that is probably one of the best known things that would be put forward as evidence is actually not at all really considered to be especially strong evidence in comparison to the Dinsdale film and the sonar readings, which Henry H. Bauer talks about in that article. Following on from that, I found another fairly short article by the same author called Common Knowledge About the Loch Ness Monster, Television, Videos and Films. And in that one, he especially talks about, this point about people being presented not necessarily with the best evidence that actually is out there. Here is a list that he compiled of the documentaries that had come out at the time of the article about the Loch Ness Monster, some of them being for and others against. And in this table, it shows the numbers of these documentaries that actually presented. On one side is the documentaries, on the other is the evidences that they used and actually showed in the documentaries. And those areas that are in grey are the times in which they just didn't refer to this evidence at all, and you see that the majority of these documentaries actually didn't mention a lot of the things that actually would be used as evidence. I would just like to quote one short quote from that article. Neither confirmed believers nor disbelievers should be content with the programs that largely project their own viewpoint. The predominantly believing ones emit on average more than 70% of the strongest objective evidence. The disbelieving ones are even worse. Though they typically purport to take a scientific stance, they allowed viewers to be aware of only about 15% of the strongest objective, in other words scientific, evidence of sonar, film and photography coupled with sonar. In Program X, a featured scientist explains that eyewitness testimony is personal. One can never be sure of its validity. Science needs reproducible data. At this point, it would have been natural to mention that sonar gets significantly reproducible results, but that is not done, and the video fails even to mention 80% of the objective data. Now, this is important because if you read those two articles and decide that you don't believe in the Loch Ness Monster, well, then that's fine, and this obviously is I'm talking about this as a sort of larger subject. In anything, you want to believe or disbelieve in a thing because you have actually encountered what is the strongest argument, the best evidence, and then accept or reject it based on that, as opposed to, pretty well known term, a straw man. You don't disbelieve in something because what you're really doing there is attacking a straw man, not the actual position or the actual argument. So those two articles, I think, are a very good place to start. For myself personally, I would say, after having read those two articles, I'm not fully convinced, although I am curious now. And Henry H. Bauer has written a book called Enigma of Loch Ness, Making Sense of a Mystery, which I have ordered. So, that's sort of how I feel about it. Not fully convinced by that, but curious and interested to look into it more, which I think is a good attitude to take in regards to especially things like this that are less common, less acceptable, basically, and many people will feel opposed to believing in it prior to actually looking at the evidence for and against. I briefly like to also just say that Henry H. Bauer has written many other books, of which a lot of them are quite interesting, just looking at the titles, and I think I'll be buying those soon and recommend them. I think other people who like this channel would probably find some of those titles interesting. For example, one book from 2017, Science is Not What You Think, How It Has Changed, Why We Can't Trust It, How It Can Be Fixed. or from 2012, Dogmatism in Science and Medicine, How Dominant Theories Monopolize Research and Stifle the Search for Truth. Finally, Henry H. Barr also does have some talks on YouTube, so if you're interested in this man and his work, I sure am. You know, those are a few places that you can start. Now, finally, to conclude, let's tie this back to that passage that we saw in the beginning in the Life of Columba. Something I realised later on is, if you've read into this a little bit about what the actual theory from people like Henry H. Barr of what type of animal the Loch Ness Monster is, it's, you know, basically something that would be like a plesiosaur in regards to its skeleton, that it has a sort of long neck, fairly large torso, and flippers. It's understood to normally live at the great depths of the loch. And also, a very important point here, it's not understood, and in none of the accounts is it ever dangerous to human beings. Now, if we return to that passage from Life of Columba, we can realise that this is clearly a different animal entirely. First of all, in the Life of Columba account, it's not in the loch, it's in the river. So this is an animal that's in shallow waters, not deep waters. It's very, very dangerous to human beings. You know, it's actually killed people trying to kill someone in that story. So my conclusion here is Loch Ness Monster and the aquatic monster that Saint Columba of Iona encountered, two different animals. And the one that Saint Columba encountered must have gone extinct. That's why we don't see an animal like that in the RIVER Ness or in the loch either. You know, I feel like from the Orthodox Christian perspective then, that this one that Saint Columba encountered, this is in the life of a saint, also written by a saint, Saint Adam then. So that to me is something very believable. As for the Loch Ness Monster, you know, I would say I don't really think that is actually mentioned in the Life of Columba. That then, you know, if you read the Henry Boyer article, most of this really starts in the 1930s, and you know, whether or not you believe in that, I don't really think that there's a really like an Orthodox Christian way of analysing that, because if it's not mentioned in the lives of any saints, there's not really something to kind of guide us in that way. So therefore, you know, you gotta look at it and come to your own conclusion on that, really. I think that the Henry Boyer stuff that I mentioned earlier is probably the best place to start if you want to take a position on it, for or against or in between. At least then you are going to have a view that is based on what the best evidence actually is. Part of why I find this such an interesting topic is because I feel it exposes a poor methodology that we can see in many other subjects in regards to how the scientific establishment approaches them. For example, not addressing the real data that the people presenting a different viewpoint are actually making. In the case of the Loch Ness Monster, most of the funding and research begins in the 1930s, lasts up until about the 1970s. And during this time, actually, some good results came out of it, some positive things, and in those decades, this was actually taken seriously by the scientific establishment. However, what happened in essence is that as no irrefutable evidence was found in that time, like obviously capturing the animal alive or dead, the funding dried up. And it's something that you'll notice in other subjects, that this kind of scientism really can not accept something being in this sort of middle position, that maybe it's true, maybe it's not, and for now we don't know. They always want to believe that their methods can give a certain answer on everything and immediately. So what happens, you see, after the 1970s, this switch in regards to taking this subject seriously into a position of hand-waving it away, presenting these sort of straw man arguments and addressing the straw man, and not the real, evidence that was discovered from the 30s to the 70s, and just sort of mocking it into extinction really as a serious subject, because now it would be impossible to get funding for this because hardly anyone takes it seriously. And obviously that's not really a scientific approach. The scientific approach would be to explain this data that has been produced between those decades in a way that refuted that it was an animal. And some people have done that to an extent, but this is generally why this has kind of died in regards to funding, is more just because of just mockery. And I think that many people in the sort of general public, scientists as well, have not really ever looked into this in the way that Henry H. Bauer has, because they don't take it seriously, because this has sort of been introduced into the culture of this is not a sort of serious subject at all. And I think that's a very good exercise for people actually to look at this and come to their own opinions on it, and not just believe in things because you're told that it's correct or incorrect, or that you might get laughed at for believing or disbelieving in anything. Thanks for watching. This one went into some pretty unusual territory for what the channel is normally about, but I hope you enjoyed it.